Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents. I know we're getting started just a few minutes early, but the one other person that was supposed to join the stream is not able to make it. So we're just going to go ahead and get started now. I'm going to be having a discussion with Esoteric the Free, and Night Shift 10,000 is also here. The broad subject is how should we as libertarians go about spreading the message of liberty? Obviously, all of us here in this stream are ANCAPs, so we agree philosophically, economically on a lot of things. The question that a lot of libertarians and ANCAPs end up debating is what is the best way to achieve a libertarian society. Now, the reason, what prompted this discussion is in a recent patrons exclusive live stream I was hosting, I was having a discussion and I was talking about Bernie Sanders and his frequent assertion that Jeff Bezos is so utterly evil because he's a billionaire and billionaires are evil. Someone at the time pointed out to Bernie that he is a multimillionaire, and Bernie's answer was that, well, you know, that's okay because I've written a book that made everybody's life better, and because I wrote a book, and I became a millionaire because I wrote a book, that's not bad. But, you know, Jeff Bezos, he's a billionaire. And I said, well, Bernie's incredibly hypocritical because Jeff Bezos created Amazon from he started the organization in a garage that had a wood-burning stove. The reason it became as big as it was is because he created a service that significantly improved everyone's lives, and they're willing to pay him money. They're willing to pay money to Amazon because they're considered people who shop there are convinced they're better off having spent that money. So it's not evil that Jeff Bezos is that rich any more than it's evil that Bernie sold his books. It's hypocritical. Well, Esso is in the comments section, and he pointed out that what I had just done was something that others have termed vulgar libertarianism. And to explain that, basically, the term vulgar libertarianism points out that in defending big businesses like Amazon, it may be the case that they started on the basis of free market principles, and certainly I think in the case of Amazon that is true, but it is the case that people shop at Amazon because they're convinced that they're better off having spent their money there. It is also not, Amazon is certainly not as big of a corporation as it is solely because of free market principles. There's a great deal of regulatory capture that goes on there, collaboration with the states in order to help Amazon grow that large. And I guess Esso's concern is whether or not the comparison I was making is actually useful to the libertarian narrative. So I know he has sent me a link to an organization called the Center for a Stateless Society, which promotes what is called Left Market Anarchism. And that's kind of what predicated this debate. I'll give Esso a chance here to explain where he's coming from.
Well, the link that I sent to DMs was not to C4SS, even though I would argue C4SS has some valuable information relating to the exact same subject. The website I sent was the ALL, Alliance of the Libertarian Left. And to clarify, I've become sort of over the last couple months, I'm sure some people have had discussions with me. He claimed, well, first of all, My Two Cents started off asserting that that everyone here is an ANCAP. Well, I don't necessarily think that any libertarian or anarchist actually is properly any economic ideology, because as I've been looking into, I've actually been reading a lot of the more obscure Austrian literature, such as Science, Technology, and Government by Murray Rothbard, and a lot of, there are a lot of sections even in the more mainstream books, such as The Road to Serfdom or Human Action, which really suggest that the sort of conventional business model as it exists in a state society is fundamentally disconnected from how it would exist in a free society. And just like with how people associate in varying different ways, there are varying different firms with varying different approaches. I think that there are varying different models of organizing resources which would compete, and this would be predicated by just the sheer amount of marginal preferences which influence how people perceive their own individual human action to be beneficial within those exchanges, which would vary for probably even more reasons as the marginal preferences which make up those associations do in the first place. But sort of the point that I was trying to make when pointing this out is that there are various different reasons why starting a business, the availability of resources in a state society as is today, or just the idea of big businesses being the sort of default framework through which a free market would form, or how a free market would operate in the absence of state-secured legal privilege. I think that that's really misleading, and I think that it's not actually true according to what sort of Austro-libertarian methodology suggests. I think that because you have so much cartelization of the finance industry, basically from the start, it's going to by default be incredibly difficult for firms in a state society without actually being a sort of okayed by the state. Can you, like, night shift? That's really distracting me. The sort of sounds you're making. Thank you. But yeah, so because of how heavily cartelized the finance industry is, usury restrictions, licensing laws, and these various other forms of credit manipulation that occur in a state society, and it's among various other things to point to, such as regulatory capture and taxation. It's provably more difficult to obtain resources, even assuming the current rate of production. And this was confirmed by a study put out by the University of North Carolina in 2013, which shows that just absent of taxation, the average income in the United States would be roughly $330,000 a year. So, okay. But what I wasn't even close to being done. I'm sorry that I'm going on.
It's okay. Take the time, all the time you need.
I mean, like I mentioned, night shift was kind of distracting me, but yeah. So what I'm getting at though is that in a stateless society, more people have more access to more resources, just assuming the current rate of production. So that strong, and because of the Austrian explanation for why these sort of firms form in the first place, that being that people with lower time preferences collect the resources required to actually produce, and they require people with higher time preferences to work and operate their tools that they use to produce commodities. I think that the time preference would actually be very, like, the difference in time preference and how that influences whether or not people speculate to become business entrepreneurs or will generally be more predisposed to becoming or will favor wage labor. I think that degree of separation will be non-existent in the absence of the state because of how freely accessible resources are. And then, of course, there's factoring in, without the burden of regulatory capture, incentive, like sort of socially engineering certain behaviors and only allowing people to associate in certain models to a profitable degree, like what we have today. I think that innovation itself would occur at an exponential rate, because I would argue personally that without the state, the sort of company model of organizing really wouldn't exist. It would be supplanted generally by a system of networking, sort of like what exists on YouTube today, for example, where people within different communities will get together and speculate on some of their resources, in this case, time and effort editing, towards gaining in popularity and, sort of obtaining more viewers among themselves. I think that the sort of general economy and how people speculate towards creating innovations according to Austrian methodology, would look a lot more like that than what it does today. And the reason for that is that organizational hierarchy is necessarily less efficient. And I don't mean like worker co-ops are better. I mean that because information has a much more difficult time being conveyed as businesses scale up, and as more resources are managed by a single firm, this makes these firms more prone to mismanagement of their own resources. And on top of that, by networking, each individual is able to sort of mitigate the cost of speculation so that more ideas can be conveyed, and those ideas being conveyed and put to test cost each individual less, which is what I think will cause people to gravitate more towards this model of speculating with their resources.
Eso, one question. Where did you read that part where you said that if there wasn't a state, or if there wasn't like taxation or anything like that, then people's incomes would be like $300,000? Where did you actually read that?
Well, I told you it's a study from the University of North Carolina, published in 2013, but there was an article on Reason about it. I'll go ahead and post it in the side chat here.
Yes, please do. I would like to look that up.
Okay. Now, I'm going to say, incidentally, I don't disagree with a lot of what you said, and obviously, I think it makes sense that if there was no taxation, if there was no business licensing, if there was no regulation, yes, I agree, businesses would look a lot different than they did now. Now, I guess the point at the time in the discussion I was making, the point I was trying to make wasn't so much that Amazon is what it is because of the free market, but rather that it is still the case that individuals are giving money to Amazon because they are convinced they are better off with whatever product they received than they would be if they keep their money. Exactly the same as in the case if somebody buys Bernie Sanders' book, they're doing so because they're convinced they're better off having the book than they are having the money. So Bernie is the point I was trying to get across was that Bernie is being a major hypocrite by saying that it is illegitimate for Bezos to have as much money as he does, but it's legitimate for him to have as much money as he does.
Well, sure, so, you're not wrong about that, and that's a great example of vulgar libertarianism, though, in the sense that you're trying to apply this free market standard to this ugly neo-mercantilist fusion model that we have under a state society. Sure, in a free market, that's absolutely the case, but with how restricted our access is to a lot of resources because of state intervention and the sort of favoritism which exists in the market because of corporatist intervention and state secured legal privilege, that's not really an accurate case which can be made. I mean, sure, with what's available to us, Amazon is a great essentially one of the better ways of organizing, but I don't think that would be the case in a free market, as William Giles put it.
Okay, so I guess my question then would be, so if that is an ineffective, if using examples like that, you see that as an ineffective way of communicating the benefits of free market interactions of libertarianism, what do you see as an effective way?
Well, first of all, in regards to the current business model and how society exists today, I think that a great strategy would be to heavily emphasize the difference between what a libertarian stateless society would be and what currently exists. Because what currently exists is not even a rough approximation of what a libertarian society would be, and the type of people who libertarianism would appeal to are the people who are completely disillusioned with the status quo, recognize the sort of master narrative being pushed by the state as being illegitimate, and are seeking an alternative. And by attempting to legitimize the prospects of state-secured legal privilege in the markets, or make defenses of things as they currently exist in our state society, I think that that in one way is going to turn a lot of people away who would have otherwise been strongly appealed to by Austro-libertarianism. Another thing which I think libertarians need to do more broadly is they need to stop treating I've said this before, but libertarians need to stop treating libertarianism as if it supplements a specific group's preferred marginal preferences and political affiliation, I mean. Because the thing with libertarianism and what is hands down libertarianism's strongest selling point is because of what I mentioned in the beginning, where in a libertarian society, more people have more access to more resources, and people would be able to associate and could in ways which are effectively beneficial within a sort of free social structure, as in social structures are formed by groups and individuals who are seeking the most profitable ways of organizing for themselves, and it's entirely determined by their own marginal preferences and people who share those preferences. I think that a stronger case which could be made for libertarianism, which can't if libertarians are trying to treat libertarianism as if it's complementary to a pre-existing political association within a state society, is that libertarianism appeals to everyone's interests simultaneously while remaining 100% philosophically consistent. And what I sort of mean by this is because in a state society, one of the lovely dysgenic effects which the state has on how people internalize their own preferences and in relation to political association or economics and philosophy is that they treat their material preferences as being interchangeable with their philosophical leanings because of the way that political economic policy and legislation is sort of presented to people through the media and the education system. As in a state society or in just society in general, there's going to be this one set of policies forcing people to associate in a certain way. People with these marginal preferences are going to be disadvantaged if this economic policy were to be realized, and vice versa. So I would argue that the best approach libertarians could have is to deconstruct that and supplant it with a counter narrative, and you can't do that if you're engaging in vulgar libertarian messaging. So yes, there is a very outside of the simple economic arguments for big business existing in a stateless society being inaccurate. I think that there's a strong politically motivated reason why libertarians should try and separate and distinguish libertarianism as something which is fundamentally different yet appeals to everyone.
Okay. And I understand where you're coming from there. I'm going to give you one possible comeback to this. Might be, I'm sure we've all dealt with the individuals who try and say, you know, libertarians are a bunch of kooks who sit around in their drum circles discussing theory, and they don't at all care about what's happening in the real world. Now, obviously, I don't think that's true, but it certainly is a criticism that is frequently made of libertarians from people who are not libertarians.
I love the attempts to refute libertarianism from pragmatism, because, I mean, as I've pointed out on numerous occasions, statism and any statist assumptions are just completely detached from reality. I mean, first of all, in a completely materialistic perspective, which is what any state has, how are you going to have your conception of interests recognized by the state? The state simply works for whatever it deems to be in its own interests. And on top of that, because the state fundamentally is antagonistic towards non-state actors, in the sense that in order to fund itself, it requires the coercive appropriation of resources created by non-state actors, and non-state actors have no recourse in holding the state accountable or stopping the state from doing whatever it's going to do. So there's really no argument there from the statist ideology, or just practically examining how the state functions.
Okay. I guess the point I was going to make is that I still think there's some value to meeting people on the ground they're on, in that if you're having a conversation with someone who's already convinced, rightly or wrongly, he's convinced you're a kook who's part of some total fringe group that I shouldn't pay any attention to. I like to try my best to put the argument I'm making into terms he'll understand, whether the analogies hold perfectly or not. So I would still hold that the example of buying something from Amazon because you're convinced you're better off with the product than not, and you're better off buying from them as opposed to some inferior business that doesn't provide as high quality service, is there's still the point of communication about mutually beneficial interaction in which both parties are better off, that can be communicated in terms they understand, even if later on, as they get deeper into libertarianism, we can then have the discussion, well, the truth of the matter is we're not this isn't a free market. That was just an example to point out the value of voluntary interactions. I guess, would you still hold?
I think it would be more effective, and I have results to show that it would be. I've had a lot of success with this, in the idea of sort of deconstructing the narratives which underlie statism, and how the state gets people to conceive of their interests as being interchangeable with those of the state, and pointing out that libertarianism is a better means for them to reach their own perceived interests. Because the way that you are approaching this is going to require them fundamentally to sort of change not only, you know, what they believe in, but, you know, how they perceive of their own interests. And that's a lot more difficult, and that's a lot less consistent than simply approaching a Marxist, for example, and saying, hey, well, with a free market, you know, look at all these subversive networks which are being established, and, you know, we have these things like 3D printers and micro CC machines. Well, it seems that there's, with relative consistency, individuals associating within their own mutually beneficial exchanges tend to produce the actual demonstrable version of what your idea for a communist society would look like, whereas every time you've attempted to implement the Marxist methodology, it ends up in a Stalinist hellhole.
Okay.
That's sort of the approach that you can take there. And the thing with libertarianism is you can do that for anybody. You just have to understand their arguments for their position.
Okay. This Night Shift, do you have anything you'd like to add or ask before I move on?
There's also another possibility you might have to expect with this too, is that some people might not be convinced at all. They might just have their, for lack of a better term, heads so far up their asses that they just don't want to hear you. They don't want to listen to you, because I've actually in my own discussions, I've run into a lot of people like that on Twitter, in real life, on Facebook, who literally wanted to argue with me, did not want to hear my explanations, did not want to hear what I had to say. And there's also the third possibility that you're going to run into someone that's like a rock, someone that does not want to hear you. I'm not saying that you shouldn't argue for your point or try deconstructing their narratives, but there are some people that just plain do not want to hear us. They don't want to hear our message. And when they do, they always call us utopian. They always want to opt out in some way. And there's always that third argument. And really the best case scenario, the best thing that you can do is, when you encounter people like that, don't get frustrated, just move on.
Okay. And before you respond to that, so I would say again there, that's why I try my best without obviously I don't want to compromise my principles, but to the best of my ability, I want to meet people on the ground they're on, find some point of common ground from which I can launch into my argument, as opposed to trying to completely deconstruct their narrative, which I think ultimately I want to do, but I will find that people are often quite resistant to that. And if they're just going to shut down the conversation immediately, well, then who has helped?
Exactly. Well, the thing with people like that is that they're so resistant because they have a sort of internal conception of what they believe libertarianism to be, which more times than not is completely disassociated from what libertarianism actually is in its philosophical conception or application to politics. So for most of those people, and yes, I have experience in this, if you simply were to take the approach which I described, it would work on them as well, even if they're being hostile to you at first. It's sort of like planting the seed of an idea. You'll get them to come around to you if you try and market what you're arguing as something which is beneficial to what they perceive to be in their own interests. But yeah, then there are some people who, even that, it's not going to work right away, but over time, they at the time they can ignore you, they can refuse to acknowledge what you're saying. But the fact of the matter is, it's just like any other situation. They refuse to openly acknowledge it, but just because they refuse to openly acknowledge what you said doesn't mean what you said didn't stick with them. And in that case, that can eventually lead to them being turned around as well. Just simply saying this can end up actually changing minds. You don't have to have a productive debate with them.
Okay, next issue I'd like to bring up, and we talked about this a little bit before we got started, so I know it's coming. But there is also the discussion of, do we as libertarians want to avoid ideological purity spirals? Because I know you have lamented, and I have at times lamented too, that libertarians end up teaming up with conservatives or statists of the more right-wing variety in an effort to cut back the power. Let's shrink the state by using the power of the state, and libertarians will say, well, at least we'll join forces with the Republican types, with the conservative types, in an effort to fight for smaller government and then inevitably cut back the power of the state. Now, obviously, I disagree with that, because I think you can't use the state to shrink the state. The state will always act in its own self-interest and thus grow its power. But at the same time, the opposite side of that coin is, and I think we've all seen this happen in that people will comment on my videos and say, you're not a real ANCAP because this, or you're not a real libertarian because this. And certain individuals will get so engulfed with their particular ideological viewpoint that they start rejecting anyone else who calls themselves a libertarian. Again, I'm not saying that everyone who calls themselves a libertarian is, but is there the threat that if there's we get in this mindset that there's one particular method to argue against the state, that this will create really an ideological purity spiral where libertarianism has so many different splinter groups that no one is really getting anything done? Like I said, I'm not making an argument either way. I'm just saying that's one possible objection. What do you have to say to that?
And yeah, I've seen this argument sort of with quite a bit within the sort of skeptic circles on YouTube, like this sort of objection to purity spiraling. But the thing is, purity spiraling is innate to any philosophical position which has a clearly defined set of first principles. In order for libertarianism to define itself as a clear philosophical position which is distinct from conservatives or any other political affiliation, it has to necessarily weed out people who claim to be libertarians but will eventually end up but yet don't actually represent libertarian positions. And the reason why a lot of the more identitarian philosophies tend to tear themselves apart during purity spiraling is not that purity spiraling itself inherently leads to the sort of destruction of political movements. It's that those specific philosophies don't have a concise set of philosophical first principles. The problem, that's an inherent problem with the premise of identitarianism, is that they attempt to create these weird autistic prescriptive categories for what defines a descriptive characteristic. In other words, they try and take all white people, all people who operate within certain income brackets or race or genders, etc., and say, well, these people all have a certain interest. They all have a shared group interest, and they need to work towards that interest. Well, the problem there is, quite simply, there's no such thing as a group interest. Interests for each individuals may share interests because of certain marginal traits, but ultimately, these marginal preferences for each individual are going to vary in a practically infinite degree of ways. So the reason that never works out is because eventually these identitarian movements get to a point where they start having conflicts because there are competing ideas for what a group interest is. And that that can't happen within libertarianism. Well, it looks like we lost Nightshade. But
okay.
The reason that can't happen within libertarianism is because libertarianism, for one, is a fundamentally metaphysically individualist philosophy. So the other reason is because libertarianism does have a very concrete and objective set of first principles which can be demonstrated and is shared by every libertarian. That being that each individual is a moral agent, and as a moral agent, they're fully entitled to the product of their moral agency, which means that the mere possibility of political rule is itself an injustice and a crime. So the thing is that I think to libertarian political movements, it would be very beneficial for them to go through these purity spirals, because otherwise you're going to end up exactly with the problem you pointed out, of libertarians creating these partnerships with alt-righters, conservatives, or liberals, and then pretty soon conservatives and liberals or alt-righters start describing certain positions they hold as libertarian positions, which, as I sort of
Liberty hangout. Oh, sorry about that.
But as I sort of pointed out before the stream started, a great example of this would be the sort of conservative libertarian partnership, which was formed in the early 20th century because both of these groups were concerned by the growing prominence of state socialism in the West. And so what ended up being a result of this partnership is, well, one, libertarians, which previously would have just been proto-agorists and who tried to create subversive networks to compete with the state, such as the American Letter Mail Company or the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. Now they're supporting the partyarchy, and they're pushing these narratives which incentivize people to look at the state as something which can further their own interests. And on top of that, libertarians began sort of engaging in the tactics which, I criticized you for, of defending these cartelized industries or state-secured or these market firms which operate around these state-secured legal privileges that externalize costs and privatize their gains. So, and meanwhile, conservatives are pushing for their protectionist and openly, aristocratically statist positions as if these are free market ideologies. That's been every time libertarians have tried to take that approach of treating libertarianism as if it's something which is complementary to another political affiliation and has tried to ally with another political affiliation, this has consistently been the result. And we condemn it. We know exactly why that's the case. So you say that libertarianism purity spiraling is a bad thing. I would say it's probably what would be the saving grace of libertarianism, and it's not something we should be averse to even slightly.
Okay, and I see where you're going with it. I guess my concern is not so much that we don't want to weed out people who are not actually libertarians. I would just tread carefully with how we do the weeding out process, because I'm sure you know as well as I do, it's pretty easy to alienate someone if somebody just comments on your channel and says you're not really a libertarian. I think much like me, you're just going to ignore that person as some sort of kook, unless they're going to provide a reasoned argument as to why you're not really a libertarian. Because I'm just going to say my own experience. I was one of the libertarians who initially said, yeah, let's partner with the Republicans, let's partner with the conservative side and use the power of the state to shrink the state.
Yeah,
however,
I was too.
It got to the point where my eyes were open. I realized, wait, that won't happen. The state will, because politicians are individuals. They act in their own interests. When you give them that power, inevitably they end up using it to further their own interests, which means growing the power of the state. And that's why we see that the Republican Party, which is supposedly the party of small government, expands the power of government just as much as the Democrats do, and yet people in the Republican Party seem not to notice. And it's that point that I moved away from that, whereas the other libertarians pretty much either ceased being libertarians and became full-blown alt-righters or Republicans, and as Night Shift so aptly pointed out, Liberty Hangout, which still uses an ANCAP flag, yet is basically Republicans.
Yeah, the whole libertarian alt-right partnership, which happened back in 2015, that's a great modern example of this happening. where because libertarianism tried to significantly downplay its philosophical roots and what actually makes something libertarian, you ended up getting this libertarian to alt-right pipeline, which to clarify, yeah, there is no connection between libertarianism and the alt-right, but this attempt to politically strategize with the alt-right back in 2015, similar to how it happened back in the early 20th century with libertarians and conservatives allying, led to, well, the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm. And I would argue, really, the so-called libertarian to alt-right pipeline, you had a bunch of individuals who were not politically or philosophically well-versed, who learned, read a few articles written by libertarians, said, that sounds great, I'm a libertarian, ended up getting into these alt-right circles and effectively pulled over to that ideology, when in reality, I don't think they ever really understood libertarianism in the first place. Of course,
yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that, but at the same token, the sort of attempts to ally with the alt-right led to a lot of people who were very influential in these libertarian circles, who a lot of people to this day were very inspired by, ending up becoming white identitarians or monarchists. Such as we were talking before the stream about True Dill Tom, but then there's also that guy T, Love Life and Anarchy, Christopher Chase Rachels, who still claims to be an anarchist, even though he's completely gone off the deep end. What's his face? That guy who went to the Charlottesville rally, who made a video of himself crying. Cantwell, that's who I was thinking of. Cantwell. But the point is, it's happened so many times. There's an unmistakable that's clearly, it's not just people who didn't know anything about libertarianism.
Okay. So I guess to sum that up, I think I would agree with you in as much as, yes, it's good to weed out people who are not really libertarians. I would just be careful of blatantly accusing people who identify as libertarians of, you're not really a libertarian, because that's more likely just get them to shut down and blow you off. I mean, rather, let's have a reasoned discussion like we're having now.
Exactly. And another thing is, I don't think that you should be hostile towards people who aren't libertarians, who think that they are, because the thing with them is you could very easily convince them to be libertarians. But if you take that approach of, you're not a real libertarian, yeah, you're going to end up turning them away and probably never convincing them that your position is right.
Exactly.
But I mean, this serves more than just a a philosophically defining purpose, or to be more accurate, I think that this philosophical definition has a practical purpose in political messaging, because for one thing, as I sort of briefly touched upon, and as you mentioned, this allows libertarians to establish one of the most powerful arguments I think that they have, but a lot of libertarians don't make because they refuse to sort of philosophically define themselves, which is that of the sort of class dichotomy that exists between state actors and non-state actors, where the state has a fundamentally different set of interests from non-state actors, which is inherently antagonistic towards non-state actors. So another thing is that by sort of identifying a singular libertarian set of philosophical positions, the political organizations which operate around those can sort of identify, regardless of the diversity in their positions, all of them can network around sort of a colloquial conception of what they need to do in order to organize effectively and have their interests met. And another thing is that I think this would also be more productive, because it would lead to a lot more people speculating in counter economies, which I think is sort of a lot of people may disagree with me here, but I think that's the true method of libertarian political organization. When I talk about libertarian political organizations, I don't mean like parties or protest movements. I mean subversive networks of individuals who speculate with their resources towards creating products and modes of communication which specifically seek to undermine these state-established white markets or the state's ability to continue functioning.
Which is where agorism comes in, basically.
Mm-hmm. All right, at this point, we've been streaming for 45 minutes. I never really want a stream to go more than an hour because I know when it gets past an hour, the odds that people watch it go down a lot. But at this point, if anyone, those of you who are watching in the stream, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comment section now, and we'll do our best to answer them before the hour runs up.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions for me because the thing with this sort of conception of libertarianism where there's not a single economic idea which encompasses it and which sort of relies upon the idea that in a stateless society there are all these different models and ways of organizing which are going to vary from person to person depending on their marginal preferences. The thing with that is there are so many while it has more explanatory power than how a lot of libertarians would currently argue their position, there are a lot of questions it creates as well relating to specific circumstances, because that's and I think that's that's a good thing, honestly, because it sort of encourages people to not look at economizing or society as if it's going to operate under a singular economic model like it does in a state society. It encourages people to really internalize the idea that, oh, in a stateless society, my associations are truly going to be dependent on whatever I think is in my interest and whoever I associate with in their interests.
Okay. First question, I put it up here on the screen. This was a while back, but I felt it did need to be addressed. I know I used this term early on. I'm not sure how passionately, or if he even really chooses to use this term himself. But Eso did send me a link to an organization called the Center for a Stateless Society, which identifies itself as a left market anarchist think tank. Well, this question rolled in. What in the hell is left market anarchism? Eso, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, sure. This is sort of... I don't know whether or not I would consider myself a left market anarchist, even though I think, based on what they argue specifically in terms of sort of not philosophical messaging, but in terms of what they propose for their economic ideas, I would probably closer align with them than I would a Rothbardian at this point. But a left market anarchist is somebody who argues that in the sort of colloquial original use of the left and right dichotomy, which I myself would reject, free markets tend to actually gravitate more towards what was classically defined as a leftist tradition, and this has historical precedents to back it up. For instance, in the French National Assembly, where the left-right dichotomy was first originally conceptualized, which was based on people by their own described philosophical associations or political affiliations, they would choose a side of the parliament, which would or the assembly, which would best describe their positions. Bastiat and Proudhon, on a couple of occasions, went to the assembly to present ideas. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, for most people, if they don't know, was basically the first person who conceptualized the idea of mutualism. But Bastiat and Proudhon sat right next to each other in the assembly on the furthest left end of the assembly. And on top of that, a lot of ideas which are conceived of as being in the leftist tradition, such as socialism, had entirely different meanings back in the early 19th century. Socialism originally was essentially just it was sort of like a political term which didn't inherently imply Marxism. It just implied someone who seeks to undermine the current system.
Okay.
Someone who has...
well, hold on. I just want to get this in. So, would you consider yourself more of a mutualist or an agorist?
I'm not a mutualist. No.
You're not
I
a
would.
mutualist?
No, I wouldn't consider myself a mutualist. I have problems with their idea of occupation-based property,
Same.
and a lot of mutualist ideas were based on the labor theory of value. So obviously, I take issue with that. However, I think that in certain economies of scale, and possibly even the broader economy, I think that mutual credit banking could see some prominence in a stateless society, though I would there are a lot of counter arguments which could be made to that, and that would really require a stream in and of itself to talk about. But no, generally I wouldn't consider myself anything, because I don't think that a stateless society can be characterized by one model of organizing. I think that different models of organizing are going to appeal to people of different marginal preferences, and therefore you're going to see a bunch of different competing models as well as competing firms.
Okay,
So,
I'm just going to cut that off there to make sure we can get to some more questions. And just to let you know, in the comment section, for those of you who are asking, what are your thoughts on this YouTuber? What are your thoughts on this YouTuber? If I don't see what your question has directly to do with this discussion, I'm probably not going to pick that one, just because individual YouTubers, regardless of what their views may be, don't necessarily have anything to do with this discussion. So the next question I'm taking from Crod7435. Why not use secession to beat the state on top of using agorism? I think that's a strong vision on beating statism. And I think, Crod, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're saying secession in terms of formally declaring you're no longer part of the state, such as when the South secedes from the Union, or... I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong there in the comment section.
I think the Civil War actually is a pretty great example of secessionism itself not being sufficient, because that was an entire half of the United States which tried to secede from the Union, and it was easily overpowered by the North. I mean, that's not my only case against it. The fact that secessionism, a lot like violent revolution, is philosophically neutral, and therefore it's materialistic in its sort of conception of how it seeks to achieve change, which creates a lot of problems, a lot of the same problems actually as revolution. But that's the thing. Secessionism essentially has the same sort of underpinnings as trying to appeal to someone through the current party system. I'm not comparing it to the party system, but it's very similar in terms of the fact that you would have to get people to, in order to have a sort of libertarian secession, you would have to have a consensus in your society that you wanted to secede from. And really, that's the best argument that you could have, is we'll achieve an ideological consensus of libertarianism. But the problem there is that, first of all, you can do that much more effectively, as I explained during this stream, with engaging in counter economics and trying to appeal to people's material interests. But if you take that approach with agorism, then at best secessionism becomes entirely irrelevant.
Okay. On that note, I'm picking this question next because I think that it relates to the issue of agorism, which just came up. And that is that the executioner asks, So agorism, so why is there so much skepticism towards gold or silver? Why is the agorist school so focused on cryptocurrency when gold has been shown historically as a more reliable means of exchange? Now, I have heard Esso answer this question before, so I'm going to go ahead again, Esso.
Well, it's a very anachronistic question because a lot of things have been historically more reliable, and that's because of the sort of standards which existed at the time. During the Great Depression, a lot of people, of course, tried to trade around the state and tried to create counter economies because it was no longer profitable to trade in the white markets, and the state was easily able to shut that down with Executive Order 6105. Is that what would happen today? No, because for one thing, we have modern computers in encrypted ledgers, but also we can produce things at a much more decentralized scale than what we could have at the time. But so there is actually a very long, this would actually require a very long response, but I guess I'll try and simplify it. Well, firstly, not every agorist is entirely averse to using gold and silver. They would be on maybe a white market scale because gold and silver has much less utility than cryptocurrency does. But ultimately, the main point which agorists try to establish as a sort of method of getting around the state is that there are different marginal preferences which influence all behavior. I know I've said that a couple of times now, but like being skeptical of gold and silver is not a general agorist position. It's a position I happen to have, but there are plenty of people who you can find which aren't, they're gold bugs who are agorists, and that wouldn't be an inconsistent position at all.
Okay, and I will say, for the record, I am not skeptical to gold and silver. Gold and silver have asserted themselves as money, I would say, ever since for thousands of years, and I don't think they're going to cease to be the functions of that make them money. The fact that they're can be used as a unit of account, divisible, fungible, a store of value. I don't think those are going to go away because of cryptocurrency.
Well, I think precious metals will always be valuable, but the reason why I'm skeptical of any sort of gold standard is because of my skepticism towards reserve banking in general, and that's sort of like the problem with it operating on an exponential growth curve, and I don't think that model can really sustain itself in a completely free society. It would be remarkably easy to cause a bank run.
Well, and I also wanted to mention something about gold and silver. The problem with gold and silver is that they are physical. They are actual physical resources that can be shut down by a governing body or by a state authority.
Not necessarily. If you establish,
God, did I just get shut down? Oh, sorry, guys. No, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hear you, but
okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. One of the big examples where we have seen that is in my own state of Idaho when they tried to do the Liberty Dollar. The Liberty Dollar was backed up by gold and silver, or they tried to back it up by gold and silver, and the state shut them down. The problem with gold and silver is that they're physical currency or commodity models, whereas cryptocurrency is far more fluid. It is far more of a liquid resource that the government cannot control.
And that's a point of utility which cryptocurrency
Exactly.
has over gold and silver, but gold and silver is not inherently a resource which can be easily tracked by the state. If you were to establish a sort of subversive infrastructure in the same way that decentralized networks and open source software has, you would be able to trade gold and silver. But there's a lot of work between now and that eventual end goal before that can become viable. But yeah, there are just so many problems which gold has that cryptocurrency, would be able to solve, or which utilizing cryptocurrency would be a better means of actually working around these. And these can get into just the system of banking itself. For instance, loans don't scale as you loan more cryptocurrency, whereas with any system of banking which exists, that's going to be the case. If the more that you withdraw and loan, the greater transaction fees there are going to be.
All right. Well, I'm going to end on this question since we're reaching the end of the hour, just because I thought it was interesting. But DigiCraftMon, the Crystal Gem, asks, do you think art is a good way to spread anarcho-capitalism / agorism?
Yeah, absolutely. But, man, I just want to point out that, I have a lot more nuanced positions on these questions. I'm just not being allowed to answer them. I'm sorry, guys.
Okay.
But, yeah, I definitely would. But, yeah, I think I would go more into detail if we had more time, and if anyone wants to hit me up on Discord to ask about these, I'll be willing to talk about it if you have any more questions. But yeah, I think that Backwards has essentially mainstreamed anarchism, like the band Backwards, and I think that to an extent, with how easy it is to convey information, there's not a bottleneck of who can or can't produce content anymore, because of how decentralized online media is becoming. It truly is becoming an actual meritocracy, and anybody has a chance to actually become mainstream as an artist or as a commentator. But that would have been a criticism previously, and still kind of is, that artists and narratives which have state backing or are backed by the state's various media outlets are going to have more clout, but that's increasingly not becoming the case. And I think after distributed networking becomes mainstream, which I think that's going to be the trend we're going to see over the next couple years because of what YouTube is doing, that'll even more so effectively become the case.
Well, the art certainly helped the spread of communism, especially in Central and South America. It definitely helped that. So yes, art in any form can definitely help libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism. And
I would say I agree. Art has always been a powerful form of messaging. So,
yep.
If only I had more art skills.
It is more so in Central and South America because those cultures are very urban art centered. Like the culture in the U.S., or at least in most parts of the U.S., that's not necessarily as much the case. Like that sort of graffiti art, it's very underground. It's very countercultural, and that sort of always has been the case. Whereas in Central and South America, it's almost more like a mainstream tradition. So obviously political messages being conveyed through art down there, it's going to be more effective than it is here. But as I pointed out, because of these, increasingly decentralized networks, it's becoming increasingly easier to convey messages through art, which otherwise wouldn't have been seen.
All right. Well, on that note, we have passed the 1 hour mark. So, sorry if you feel like I'm cutting you off. I just want to make sure the majority of people will actually watch this stream. And I know if we go for 4 hours, people who are much like me will see it'll pop up in their feed and say 4 hours. I don't have time for that, and they'll pass by. But great discussion. Hope we can have more of them. And I hope everybody. I know I'll be re-listening to this just to be able to give some of the things more thought. Hope everybody else learned something.
I may have to make a whole video about this because, even though, some people may be satisfied with my answers and you guys might, I don't feel like I am personally. And these are just really nuanced.
I look forward to it.
Looking forward to it as well. So anyways, SO Night Shift, thanks for being here. And I will quick when this is over. I'll post another link in my community tab to my Discord server. If anyone wants to get in on there, I know I unfortunately have not been quite so active, but people have been having some lively discussions. So, and I know Esso's got one as well. So thanks everybody for being here. And as always, that is my 2 cents. So take it for what it's worth.